models. Here are some questions that I'm posing to you. I want you for each question to choose one of the two possible answers. And not only choose your answer, but I also want you to come up with a rating of your confidence for each answer for the item. So if you absolutely have no idea what the answer is, if it's just a pure guess, then you'll want to choose the value 0.5 because we're going to be essentially looking at confidence ratings on like a scale ranging from like 0.1, representing like 10% confidence, all the way up to 1.0, which is 100% confidence. So therefore, if it's a guess, if it's 50-50, then your confidence rating would be 0.5. And then of course, values that are 0.5 and above are going to indicate some intermediate levels of confidence, with obviously the higher numbers reflecting higher confidence. So again, choose one answer for each question and then rate your confidence that you have in that answer. I'll give you all just about a minute or so.
Can you remind me what the scale is for confidence?
Yeah, sure. So it's essentially ranging from 0 to 100. If it's easier to think about it in terms of percentage, you can. But for example, if you were taking a guess and it would be a 50-50 chance, you could either say that you felt like 50% confident or 0.5 on the rating scale. It's essentially in decimal form in the form of like 10. So like 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, etc., all the way up to 1. Okay, so for the purposes of this discussion, it actually doesn't matter how accurate your guesses or your answers were. If you do really want to know what the answers are, this is them. But what actually matters more here in this example is the relationship between how accurate you were and how confident you rated yourself to be when giving that answer. So in several studies on cognitive illusions, participants were given a long list of questions, pretty similar to this, like on the slide, just more of like sort of random trivia questions. And then after they would answer an item, they were also asked to provide their confidence rating as well. And then after they did all of this, providing their answers and giving their confidence ratings, then the researchers plotted their accuracy as a function of their confidence rating. So essentially plotting these to help better illustrate the relationship between the two. So some of the typical findings are shown on this slide. And so the 45-degree line that's there in orange, this indicates when confidence and accuracy are perfectly in sync. And this is definitely not the way that things actually end up going. This line is very theoretical and it's an abstract. And actually how people tend to do with this kind of task is what's plotted in red. And so this kind of plotting, plotting confidence in relation to accuracy is called a calibration curve. And the closer the curve, or what you end up generating, usually a curve, the closer that it is to this orange 45-degree line, the better the fit between confidence and accuracy. So essentially, we can think of it as there being a positive correlation, that the more confident you are, the more correct you are, and vice versa. So if there are deviations from this line in terms of being below the line, like the case with the red sort of squiggle curve that we have going on, this is demonstrating overconfidence. So this is showing that people were more confident than they were accurate. And then, of course, deviations in the other direction, where you're seeing a pattern of responses above this plotted line, would be underconfidence. And this is a lot more rare, because this is when people would be really accurate, but not very confident. So essentially, I bring up all of this just to point out that, and not only I'm pointing it out, but the research has pointed out that people's impressions of their own accuracy are, for the most part, overinflated. And so this idea of this cognitive illusion of overconfidence, it can interfere with our decision making. So if your confidence in your judgment is inappropriately high, right? You're like, I know what the answer is, and you actually don't. Then you're probably not going to essentially be a team player. And this means that you won't get additional information or help that could help you better solve the problem. And this is because you are so confident that you don't stop to consider anything else, whether that's someone else's opinion, other pieces of information. And so this means that even if there are resources available to you, if you are overconfident, you're going to put a lot more weight on your own approaches, your own intuition, your opinions, your viewpoints, in comparison to any other more objective information that you could draw on in that situation to help you with making decisions. And so essentially, overconfidence is, in the context of decision making, it's arrogance in the context of decision making. And like the saying, pride comes before a fall. Having an overconfident, overinflated sense of how right you are actually will impact the kinds of decisions that you're going to make. Okay, so now we are going to transition to talking about some models of decision making. And so obviously the decisions that we make shape a lot of different aspects of our lives. And so many decisions in the real world, such as making investments or gambling, are risky in the sense that their outcomes aren't known with certainty. And in order to study decision making, we also need to take into account information from other fields, such as economics, political science, as well as statistics, obviously, like we've been talking about with probabilities, as well as philosophy. So we're not going to go do a deep dive into any of those fields, but just wanted to point out to you that when it comes to trying to generate models of human decision making, it's actually a lot more of an interdisciplinary sort of process. We need to look beyond psychology to help us get the best sort of idea of how we go about making decisions. And so, of course, like we've talked about, decision making is really interesting to study because you know, it seems like we're not very good at it. You know, in the context of all of these different cognitive illusions and errors, you might come to the conclusion of like, wow, we're not, humans aren't very good at making decisions. And that is true in certain contexts or situations in comparison to others. But for the most part, we're pretty good decision makers. And so that's led some cognitive psychologists to wonder more about that. Well, how do we go about making more well-informed, healthier decisions? So it's been proposed that there are sort of 5 general phases, steps, stages, however you want to term it, when it comes to making decisions. And so the first phase is setting a goal. And this involves, well, taking stock of the plans that you might need to make for the future in the context of your principles, in the context of your resources, what you've been prioritizing. And then after that, after you've set your goals and you have a sort of general direction that you're heading in, then you need to gather information. And so this often involves figuring out what some of your various options are for the short term and also the long term. You also need to think about what kinds of approaches might be better suited for you. Trying to think, well, okay, is path A, is that really going to be helpful in the long term? Is that going to get me farther down the road toward my goal, or is it actually not going to be as helpful? And thinking about like, well, what are some of the parameters that might affect the decision? Of okay, if I go to grad school and it costs X amount of money, will I be able to make that back up in a reasonable amount of time? There's a lot of different parameters that need to be researched and have information about them thought out. And then, of course, there's the next step of structuring the decision. So once you have sort of all of the different materials that can help inform you in the decision-making process, then comes this part where you're starting to organize the information. You're starting to categorize it, maybe sort it in certain ways of, oh, this seems really helpful. This seems like it's going to be essential. Maybe you have a sort of like a maybe pile, so to speak, of like, maybe that'll help, maybe that won't. And then you move on to making your final choice. And so this means that you are selecting, you are coming up with your game plan, with the way forward from the various options that you've considered. And this can also involve another step, a sort of a meta decision making of its own, in terms of deciding, well, when do I have enough information? When have I reached a place where I'm like, okay, I'm ready to make my choice? You have to have that sort of self-awareness too, and that sense of I have enough information to act on. And then at the very end of all of that, then it's, and this is sometimes the step that not everybody engages in, but for people who are better adept at decision making, they'll engage in a final step of evaluation. So they will go through and consider, okay, what went well and what didn't? Did I actually reach my goal in the way that I wanted to? Could there have been a better way? Do I need to maybe go back and get more information and maybe sort of start part of this over again? And so although I'm talking about these tasks and sort of this sort of particular order, obviously, even just as I've given examples, right, we can see that you'll have to go back and forth between them. It's not going through these phases in the process of making a decision. It's not this serial step by step. Okay, well, I got step 1 done, so Now I'm just going to move on to step two. You can revisit any of these at any point of the decision-making process. And so in addition to examining decision-making from this sort of more stage-based kind of model, there have been two other approaches that are more general that have been proposed to try to analyze the decision-making process. And so the first sort of larger category of these kinds of models or approaches are called normative approaches. And these kinds of approaches, they assume that there is a rational decision maker who has very well specified and clear particular preferences in the decision-making process. And included in this approach are some of what are called classical decision theorists. We're not going to go in depth about that, but just kind of want to sort of nuance the sort of cognitive psychology timeline of things and just point out that these more normative approaches, these were more of the sort of original ideas behind how we make decisions. So we're going to talk about these sort of more classical decision-making models, and then we will talk about what's come out of those. So most of the models that come out of this kind of approach to studying human decision-making are based on mathematical models of human behavior. And so again, seeing this as more of the classical approach to understanding human decision-making, this makes sense. It kind of goes hand in hand with the cognitive revolution in the 1960s and kind of this emphasis on computers and being able to compute and come up with models of human behavior. And so there are three assumptions that are really fundamental to the various kinds of these models of human behavior from the sort of more like normative camp. And so the first is that the idea is that decision makers are fully informed about all possible options available to them, and they're also well informed about all the possible outcomes of said decisions as well. So second, it's thought that these very rational decision makers are very sensitive and aware of the differences that lie between various options, even if these differences are more subtle and nuanced in nature. And so this means that they are able to evaluate the differences between various options, no matter how subtle those differences might be. So no matter how similar certain options might seem, this approach to human decision making says, well, the rational decision maker is still able to understand them as distinctive, separate options. And then finally, the decision makers are fully rational when it comes to their choice of options. And so what this means is that they are making choices in order to maximize value. And so these choices, again, are sort of based on this sort of rational focus on maximizing the value of a certain choice. And this maximization of value is kind of inherently tied to being the measure of what's rational, right? It's reasonable that you would choose the most valuable option to you. So all of these normative or classical decision-making models, they assume that people try to make well-reasoned decisions. It's assumed that we're going to try our best to use the most of our rational thinking abilities to approach decision making. And it's also thought that these well-reasoned decisions are based on the following factors. So the first one is that it's assumed that people will consider all of the possible known alternatives, and that considering all positive alternatives is what will help lead to a well-reasoned decision. And second is that people will use, and this is sort of similar, but people will use the maximum amount of information that's available to them. So essentially sort of leaving no stones unturned in the search for all the possible options that someone might have. Third, it's thought that people will really carefully weigh the costs, risks, benefits of each and every alternative. And also that they will very carefully calculate all of the probable outcomes of each choice. And then finally, the idea is that people essentially will be maximal reasoners. That is, they will act on all of these preceding assumptions in order to, like I said on that previous slide, maximize value and be fully reasonable in their decisions. So that all sounds well and good, but you're likely wondering, as I was after reading through about these models, well, how often do actually any of us do these things when we're making a decision? And so we're going to look at an example to try to better understand what these classical decision-making approaches or these normative approaches have to say about human decision-making and how that actually might play out. So suppose that a decision maker is considering two different job offers. And so under this model, then the person should choose the job with the highest expected value, right? That would be the most reasonable, rational thing to do. And so if we assume that both of these jobs have the exact same starting salary, but that the employees who work at company A, there is a 50% chance of getting a 20% salary increase after their first year. Whereas the other option is company B, in which employees have a 90% chance of getting a 10% salary raise. So if we are taking this more mathematical kind of approach, the decision maker can engage in calculations so that they can look at the expected value of each job. And so this is generated by the probability of a certain outcome times or multiplied by the corresponding value. So in the company A example, we have the 50% probability of getting a salary increase, and then we have the actual value associated with that. And so this gives us an expected value of 0.1. If we do the same thing with the second example, we get a value of 0.09. And so, of course, if someone is a rational decision maker, according to these sorts of mathematical models, then a person is going to choose the job with the highest expected value. And so in this example, that would mean that they should always choose company A, right? Based on this mathematical breakdown, that should be the correct choice. But what these mathematical models fail to do, though, is fully and entirely predict what people actually decide to do. And so in part, because these mathematical models didn't really comprehensively sort of demonstrate human decision making, there was another normative approach that was developed, and this is called subjective expected utility theory. And so in order to, in this model, the assumption is that the ultimate goal of decision making is to seek pleasure, seek benefit, and to avoid or minimize pain. And so in order to do this, people are thought to calculate what's called the subjective utility, or essentially their own personal way of valuing something, as well as the subjective probability, their guesses at how likely it is for something to occur. So essentially what this means is that there are going to be different judgments of situations based on different people's subjective values, and also their different subjective feelings towards the outcomes. So for example, if you're looking at a job and something that's really important to you is having a good insurance plan, you might place a lot more value in that in your decision-making process than someone else who, let's say that their spouse has a really good insurance plan through their job that's already covered this person who's considering this job offer. So kind of regardless, they're like, I don't really care about the healthcare benefits as much. Also, if somebody is feeling more optimistic or not about if they feel like, yeah, I think that this is a step in the right direction. This is the job that I want to get me to like the next stage in my career, versus somebody who's like, I don't know, like I kind of could go either way with this job. Then these individual differences are then going to lead to these more subjective, essentially values that then are going to drive the decision-making process for each person in a different way. So essentially, to sort of put this back into the context of our job offer example, so instead of taking the probability and multiplying it by this more objective sort of value, right? Well, there's a 50% chance of a salary increase and there's a 20% salary increase. This is allowing us to take the person's judged subjective probability rate and essentially multiplying them across essentially the pros and the cons of a job offer. So to use this sort of model's language, subjective positive utility. So that essentially means, what are the parts of this job that are going to be beneficial to me? What are the pros? Versus what are the subjective negative utilities? What are going to be some of the bummers? What are going to be some of the drawbacks that I need to consider in this job offer? And then you are subtracting the negatives from the positives. So you're sort of saying, okay, all things considered, do the cons, outweigh the pros, or is it the other way? And then of course you would choose, okay, well, if a job has more pros than cons, in comparison to the other job, yeah, of course, I'm going to choose this job. It has a higher expected value for me overall. And it's based on my own subjective wishes and desires. It's not based on just sort of more pure objective math. And so, yeah, like I said, this is going to be different based on each person. And so this allows for a more individualized way of understanding decision-making that accounts for all the different variables of what it means to be a person that the previous mathematical-based models couldn't do. And so as researchers began to test these ideas, they continued to discover that, even though we might be adjusting for things like individual differences and preferences, um, people still don't behave in the way that some of these models would assume. And so as a result, another main approach to decision making, it gained more acceptance and prominence in the cognitive psych world. And so these are called descriptive approaches, and they're based on empirical observation and experimental studies on people's choices and the behaviors that go into those choices. And so, like it says here on the slide, obviously, this is not as abstract and theory-based like the normative approaches, but rather it's a little bit more based in actually seeing these things. So doing observational studies and also doing experimental studies and being able to see actually what happens in real time versus calculating some numbers and saying, well, based on this model, this is predicted to be what's going to happen. And so not surprisingly, the experimental evidence that has come from these kinds of models, they show us that oftentimes people's choices are at odds with the assumptions of the more rational based theories that are out there. And then finally, and most recently, we have what are called naturalistic approaches to decision making or naturalistic decision making. And so this is about 20 years ago. There's a group of cognitive researchers, and they began to investigate decision making from an entirely different perspective. And they argued that decision making was a really complex process, that it's just not something that could be adequately reproduced in the lab. It wasn't going to be good enough, right? There wasn't going to be very good ecological validity in terms of understanding, oh, okay, what we're seeing in the lab is actually exactly what goes on in the real world, so to speak. And so they started were kind of inspired by some initial research that had been done on expert chess players. And then they quickly started to look at experts in other realms who have to make really quick decisions in real life. And so they eventually started looking at like fire chiefs and commanders of like firefighting units. And then eventually they looked at some other fields as well. And so part of the reason for this shift in this interest in those who are in areas of work and of life who have to make quick decisions in real life situations is because these situations are not just sort of your everyday general, okay, I'm at the store, what kind of peanut butter should I get? Should I get smooth? Should I get crunchy? Should I get organic? Should I not? These are high stakes situations where there are really important outcomes that are possible, really a lot more of sort of life or death almost, sometimes literally, depending on who the expert is and what the issue is. And additionally, the decision makers in these kinds of scenarios, they tend to be experts in their particular field. So for example, there are people like doctors, fire chiefs, like I said before, nuclear plant supervisors, neurosurgeons. And so, like I said, this perspective, it's come to be called naturalistic decision making. And it really focuses on a specific kind of group of decisions or kinds of decisions. And so these are decisions that are made in settings where what the issue is or what the emergency. It's not maybe really clear at the very beginning, or situations where the conditions are changing really rapidly. These sorts of scenarios also involve a lot of high risk or high pressure sorts of situations. There are what are called multiple feedback loops. That is, there are multiple sort of actions that can then lead to one outcome that can then might require another action that requires another outcome, things like that. And there are also multiple players in terms of like personnel, for example. And also like there are a lot of different settings too that can sometimes be involved in making that decision. And this, the study of these particular decisions, it focuses more on trying to understand the way that people size up situations rather than trying to understand how they might go about selecting certain courses of action. So it's really looking at decision making as being dependent on the way in which people size up a situation, how they understand a situation and approach it. And a central goal of this approach is to try to really demystify this idea of intuition. And this is often because if you are asking experts, why did you decide to do that? Oftentimes they have a hard time telling you exactly what led them to that. They'll just say, well, I don't know. It was maybe like just a gut feeling. Like I had a feeling that, the structure was unsafe and it was going to cave in. And that's why I pulled my men out when I did. And, that's why they didn't end up getting crushed when that building fell. Or they don't really have a more sort of conscious way of explaining it. A lot of what was happening was unconscious. And so one of the methods that naturalistic decision maker researchers have used to try to understand these more intuitive sorts of decisions is called cognitive task analysis. And there were there are researchers named Crandall and Getchell-Ryder, and they published this really sort of foundational study in this area of naturalistic decision making. And so they were studying nurses who seemed to have this knack for being able to diagnose serious illnesses and issues in premature babies on what's called the neonatal intensive care unit, or the NICU. So these are often babies that have experienced complications at birth, or they were born early, and so they need to have extra time in the hospital and they need to receive extra care. And so some of these NICU nurses, it was found that they were able to figure out what was going on with the babies before an actual diagnosis was able to be verified by certain lab tests or things like that. So these are nurses who are like, I just know that baby has a heart murmur. I just know. And then it comes back and the heart exam, I don't know exactly what heart test you would do for a murmur. Echocardiogram, ultrasound, I don't know. These are just words I've learned on Grey's Anatomy, honestly. But the test would come back and say, oh yeah, this baby has a mild heart murmur. And when these nurses were asked, well, how the heck did you know this? They were like, I don't know. I just did, right? I just knew that there was something going on with that baby. And so these researchers were able to use this cognitive task analysis approach to identify some of the cues that these nurses were picking up on and some of the behavioral patterns. And we're not going to go into the details of exactly what cognitive task analysis is. But just ultimately what I want you to know is it was a way to try to break down these more intuitive processes and understandings that contributed to someone's decision-making process. And it was really cool. Because of this research, a program had been developed and has been implemented to train NICU nurses on how to really carefully examine and look for certain signs and symptoms of illnesses and conditions before they really snowball and it's too late. And this is because preemies can often, one moment they're okay and the next moment they might be having trouble breathing. And so it's helped these nurses have a lot more attunement to what's going on in their patients. So finally, we're going to talk about the sort of essential characteristics of these more naturalistic decision-making, these naturalistic decision-making processes that go on. And again, this is specific to these more high stakes, high pressure kinds of situations, not necessarily the more sort of mundane decisions that we have to make on a day-to-day basis. So the first one of these essential characteristics is what is called process orientation. And so this has to do with the fact that these naturalistic models, they don't try to predict what option is going to be carried out, but rather they focus on trying to describe the cognitive processes that are used to choose. So the focus isn't on the decision-making outcomes, it's more focused on, well, what led to those decision-making outcomes? What kind of processes were going on in the background? So another characteristic is what's called situation action matching decision-making. So just it really rolls right off the tongue. And essentially, this involves there being a match between the particular situation and the particular action that's needed. Essentially, the relationship between the situation and possible actions is really more of this sort of one-to-one basis that seems to come up and that seems to be involved of like, well, I saw this particular situation, right? I saw this baby exhibiting these certain signs and symptoms, and that meant that there was a specific action that I needed to take. And so this is in contrast to other ways of approaching decision making, where you are coming up with a list of options and then sorting through them and trying to think about which one's best. But like I said, this one's kind of more of this association between, well, this was a situation and this was what needed to happen in that situation. And then next we have context-bound informal modeling, informational modeling, not informal modeling, it's formal. And this is the idea that modeling, the modeling that's done by the more experienced decision makers, it's done within the context of that decision maker's particular domain or set of knowledge. And so again, somebody like a fire chief is going to be drawing on a very, very particular set of information, a very well-known set of information as well, in order to engage in cognitive processes to find the right solution and to make a quick decision. The fire chief's not going to be pulling on other unrelated information. It's going to be things like, okay, fire patterns and behavior, understanding of structure design. I don't know exactly what goes into that because I'm not a fire chief. So that just goes to show that, yeah, these more specialized decision makers also have a specialized set of knowledge that they're pulling from. And then finally, these naturalistic decision-making models, essentially, they're prescriptive. And so what that means is that there's this empirically based sort of trial and error method that has resulted in very useful solutions. So these aren't the kinds of decision-making situations where it's like, well, I'll try this one thing and then, okay, that doesn't work. But no, it's again, it's sort of, this sort of goes back to the situation action matching decision making, where it's prescribing to you. Well, situation A came up, and that means that action A needs to be taken. And so again, I talk about these different characteristics because they are specific to the naturalistic decision-making process and the underlying concepts of these models. So that's where we're going to end for today. Does anybody have any questions? No. Cool. All right. Well, enjoy a couple extra minutes of freedom. I hope you all have a good weekend, and I will see you for our next live lecture on Wednesday.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Take care. Bye.